Hey programmers, welcome back. It's time to introduce a new topic in this course, and in particular what I want to do is show you about functions. Functions are a super important topic in programming, and it's going to be a concept that you use almost every single day as you write code. And so if you want to follow along for this lecture, I'm going to create a new file, and I'll just call it functions.js, and we'll just spend all of our time inside of this file for now. And so what I want to do to begin is start with some motivation. So far in the course, we've been getting our feet wet in understanding how expressions evaluate in JavaScript. In particular, we're probably feeling pretty good about predicting the evaluation of those expressions. And so far, we've basically been using those expressions as like isolated patterns. Let's just write down one of these expressions to get going. So let's say I had two numbers, let's say 20 and 25, and I add them up. What I can also do is take that sum and divide it by 2. You may notice that this pattern will actually give us back the average of 20 and 25, right? To find the average of two numbers, simply add them up and divide them by 2. What I could do is just console.log that result. So I should see 22.5. So I'll give that a run. I'll make sure that my terminal is right inside of my folder, which I have called lecturing. The most important thing is that your terminal is right next to the file you're trying to execute, right? So I'll just run node functions.js. And there I see that average printed out. Let's say I wanted the average of some other two numbers. Let's say some very different numbers. Let's say 100 and 113. And for the most part, the pattern that I use stays the same, although I'm just using two different input numbers, right? Only the 100 and the 113, that is only the numbers that I actually want to calculate the average of, are changing over here. And so what we're showing is that this code is really something that I can use to do a specific job, right? The job of finding the average of two numbers. And so what I want to do by the end of this lecture is find a way that I can reuse this code in a much cleaner way and really have a chunk of code that I can reuse that's very task specific. A better way to reuse code like this would be to use a function. So let's jump right in and let's define our very first function. Luckily, functions really build off of what you were learning recently. And to define your first function, what you really just want to do is start by declaring a variable. So I'm going to declare a variable. I'm going to call it calculateAverage. And this is just really a variable. And when I assign it a value, I have to assign it this new thing we call a function, right? So some new syntax here is you use the special keyword called function. Then after that, you're going to need to open up some parentheses and also some curly braces. And so this syntax is pretty new. These parentheses and curly braces probably remind you of an if statement, but then it's kind of strange how we're assigning this function thing, into a variable. But just bear with me. What I can do inside of the braces of this function, I'll refer to that as like the body of this function. What I can do in the body is really just write any code that I want. So let's say I wanted to do a few things. Let's say console.log I am a function. And I'll console.log something else like ending function. Right? So right before the function is done running, I'll just print out ending function. So notice that I can put multiple lines of code inside of the body of a function. That's totally fine. And really treat this calculateAverage as kind of like a variable, like it always is. So you can totally refer to this variable name. So let's say I just do calculateAverage, but what if I just console.log that? So here's the interesting bit. When we print out this variable, it's going to contain a function. So let's run this code. And so here we see some funny output. It literally tells us that, hey, you printed out the calculateAverage function. The important thing to know right now is, notice that we're not console.logging any of these internal messages, right? We're not going to print out I'm a function or ending function because we're not actually utilizing the function. So when it comes to using a function in like a meaningful way, step 1 would be to define a function, which we did. What we also need to do is call the function. So right now I'm missing the function call. And so instead of just printing out the function itself, I actually want to use the function. To do that, you still refer to the function's name. So I'll just say calculateAverage. But the key here is to add some parentheses at the end of it. So you want to open and close parentheses. Right? So right over here, this is where we have the function definition. So I'll call it my function definition. Then below is where I have my actual function call. So let's run this code. Now I'd be calling the function once. Notice that I do see these messages that are on the inside of the function printed out, right? I am executing these two console.logs. So here's what we'll do. Let's have a few relative landmarks. So let's say that I console.log one over here. And then after calculateAverage, I'll console.log 2. Let's try to follow the order of execution here. So in general, really just adding to our current understanding of JavaScript. And so far, you understand JavaScript as a language that evaluates top down and in general left to right. So if my cursor is JavaScript right now, what it's going to do is read the code in my file, and it's going to see this variable, right? And it knows that I'm assigning this variable some value. The value that I'm assigning happens to be a function. The important thing to know is it's not going to execute the code that's inside of the function yet. In other words, I don't print out these two console.logs yet. Really, the first thing that executes as I go down is going to be the console.log of 1. So that's why I see it first over here. And then from there, we hit this function call to calculate average. And what JavaScript's execution is going to do is jump inside of the function definition and now run the code that's inside of the function. So now I see I am a function and then ending function as my next two messages. And then once we're done executing all of the code inside of the function, JavaScript actually jumps back to where we originally called it and goes on to the other lines that come after it. So when we call a function, the execution will kind of jump around in the space of the code. It's no longer just like a top-down fashion. So what I can also do is reuse this function. That's really the whole point. So let's say after I print out 2, I call the function twice over again. You can probably anticipate what's going to happen, right? I have 1, I am a function, ending function, 2, then I am a function, ending function, and then I call it once more over here. And so the true utility of a function is that I define it once. So I write the code once, but I can easily reuse it again and again by just calling the function by name. So let's keep working toward our goal of building a actual calculate average function, right? So here's what I'll do. I'll clean up some of this code, and let's just call our calculate average function once right now. And what I want to do is write a function that, of course, calculates the average of our two numbers. Something that I'll want to do is accept those two numbers that I want to calculate as inputs, right? The hope is I can use this function with any two numbers I give it, and it should always return to me the proper average of those two numbers. And so if I want my function to take in some inputs, what I can do is have it accept some parameters, right? So between these parentheses, what I can do is kind of list like some variable placeholders. I'll say num1, num2. They kind of behave like variables, but note that we don't say let in front of them. So this would be the correct way. And what I want to do on the inside of the function is write some code that would find the average of these two variables, basically, right? So I'm trying to write this function in a general way. I can't be certain right now what num1 and num2 are, but nonetheless, I can still write like a formula that will calculate the average of these two numbers. So maybe I'll write it in some different variables. So what I'll say is create a sum and have that be num1 plus num2. And then from there, to calculate the final answer, what I'll say is just maybe like final average will be equal to the sum divided by 2. And of course, you probably recognize a way to write this expression in a single line. I just want to show you that, hey, you can have multiple variables and multiple lines inside of a function. And so for now, let's just say on the inside of the function, we just print out what the final average is. And so what I'll need to do is adjust how we actually call the function. So if I look at the function definition, my function is looking for two numbers to take in, right? num1 and num2. And so what I have to do is now call the function passing in two numbers. So let's say I pass in two numbers like 10 and 15. So I'll do 10 comma 15 over here. And basically num1 is going to refer to 10 and num2 is going to refer to 15. So let's go ahead and run this code. There I see the average of 10 and 15, right? 12.5. Let's step through what happened in this code. So again, JavaScript evaluates top down. It's going to see this function definition, but it's not going to run the code inside yet, right? The function only runs when we call it. But on line 11, we do call that function. And so what I do is I jump into the function definition. So I jump into this thing, but I bring some data with me. Num1 is going to refer to 10. So kind of like visually in my mind, I kind of replace it. So it comes in as 10, and then num2 comes in as 15. And since now I have actual values for num1 and num2, this is really just some regular JavaScript evaluation. So I know that 10 plus 15 is going to give me 25, so sum is just 25. Then I just do 25 divided by 2, which is going to give me 12.5 as my final average, which I then just print out. So I'll bring this code back to the original. And the huge upshot of all of this is my functions were in a general way, right? It just consumes num1 and num2. But then when I call this function, I can give it any numbers I want, right? So let's find the average of like 31 and 40. That should also find the average of those two numbers. And so to make sure we understand the order of how these lines execute, I'm going to add some relative print statements once again. So at the top over here, what I'll do is print out A, just the regular string A, followed by the string B, and then the string C. what I want you to do is kind of predict the order that we're going to print out some things. So you definitely know that we're going to print out in the long run 12.5 and 35.5, but where do these other letters show up, right? Do you understand the relative order of how this code executes? So let's give it a run and notice what happens here. So if we step through this one a little closer, as always, right, JavaScript evaluates top down, so it sees this function definition, but it does not evaluate any code on the inside. Really, the first thing it will execute is this console.log on line 11. So it prints out A, and then it sees a function call. So at this point, now execution jumps to inside of this function where it calculates the average of 10 and 15, and it'll just print out 12.5. From there, there's no more code inside of this function, so now this function will return back to where it was originally called. So that means execution jumps from line 6 kind of back to around the end of line 12, and then it just goes on to any normal code. So now it prints out B, right? There it is. And now a similar thing happens where I jump into the calculate average of 3140, so it's calling a function, jump to the inside of that, print out the average of 35.5, it's done over there, returns back to where I originally called it, and then it finally just prints out the regular C. So don't freak out if you find the order of execution here a little confusing. It will take some time to get used to, but it's really the same rule again and again. Whenever I call a function, I jump back to the function definition and execute the code inside. Right now, let's keep adding to our understanding of functions. So I'm going to clean up some of this code, and let's say we just ran our calculate average of 1015. So here we have it, and this is a pretty great average function. However, if you want to use functions in most scenarios, what you'll want to do is not actually console.log on the inside of your function, right? You don't want to console.log the answer over here. The actual usual way you want to define a function is by having it return your final answer. And this is an actual keyword in JavaScript and in many programming languages. So instead, what I'll prefer to do is don't console.log here. Instead, return. Return is a special keyword. You can only use it inside of functions. And what I'm saying is, now that my calculate average function has a return statement, anytime I call the function, that function call itself will evaluate to the value that I returned. In other words, if you wanted to still see the result of calculate average, you're going to have to console.log around it. And I know what you're thinking, it seems like I just moved the console.log around. I'll show you the huge advantage of writing it in this way. But for now, let's make sure we haven't changed any of our function's behavior. Right, so I still see a 12.5. So really the first thing that executes is on line 11. And in particular, I'm trying to console.log some data. However, this expression on the inside is a function call. What I have to do is evaluate this function call first. So like you already know, we jump into the calculate average function. We find the final average, which is 12.5. And then we say return a 12.5. Return means return back to where you called it. And basically, it's going to go back to this function call and replace the call itself with the return value, which I just said was 12.5. Right, and that's how I'm able to just see that plain old 12.5. And the huge advantage of this is this function call actually results and evaluates to some data that I can reuse. In other words, what I have highlighted right now is really just a number, right? That number is just the average of 10 and 15. In other words, I can do cool things like do any additional arithmetic with these things. So let's say that this, some expression, I can save it in a variable. I can say let the result equal that number. And I can do other stuff with that result, like maybe do some additional operations like result plus 2, right? So can you anticipate what this is going to print out? And you guessed it, it's just going to be 14.5. As programmers, there are many times where we're not just calling a function and that's it. Usually what we're going to do is take the result of a function and perform some other operation on it, right? And if I use a return statement in a function, this lets me grab the result of some function and then save it so I can do some additional operations on it. So if we step through this code, technically on line 11, calculate average of 10, 15 evaluates to 12.5. And then this is just doing 12.5 plus 2, which you know is going to be 14.5, right? So you're going to find return statements pretty useful. One thing I do want to make you aware of is since return literally returns back to where you called the function, whenever you execute a return statement, any code after, like over here, will not actually execute. So if I say like buy over here, you notice that my VS Code is actually dimming that line because it foresees that this line is not even reachable. So let's add some relative print statements on the inside of my function maybe. So I'll console.log hi, first thing inside of the function. And then after the return, I'm going to try to console.log by. So if I run this code, right? I see the hi, but I don't see the bye. So do try to remember that return will actually exit a function. And so I'll just go ahead and remove some of this extra code. And so this is our basic calculate average function. It returns some result. And like we just said, it's a good idea that my function actually returns the final answer. That way I can continue to do some operations on it if I wanted to. But let me show you a common mistake, right? So let's say on line 12, I'll still print out the result just in its like variable stored form. But let's say I forgot to say like return over here on line 6. So I'm going to take out this return and let's see what happens now. So bear in mind, there's only one console.log in my code, and it's going to try to print out the result of my calculate average. When I run this code, we get some interesting behavior. Notice that we see undefined. And try to recall where we've seen undefined before, right? We got it when we used in like an illegal or invalid index when looking inside of a string, right? Recall that undefined is the common default value in JavaScript. And what we're saying here is if a function doesn't have a return statement, then by default it returns undefined, right? So this would actually be incorrect. So if you wanted to give back final average as your answer, then you need to actually say return. And so if you're seeing undefined when you deal with functions, you'll want to make sure that you're returning some value, right? And that means you should literally have a return statement like this. So let's write another function, and this time I'll work in some of our previous concepts about conditionals, right? So the beauty of programming, why I think it's so fun, is really all of these concepts build up. So let's say I had some function. So to start over, right, we declare a function by just making a variable. I'll give that variable a name that kind of describes what the function is going to do. And so I'll create a function called yell or whisper. I'll explain why that is in a moment. And I'll assign this a function. All right, so this is our classic function definition syntax. Cool. And before I actually fill out the body of this function, I'll leave myself a little comment so I don't forget. So we're still going to do this, but I'm going to give myself an example of what I want to accomplish. And so I hope that when someone is to call our yell or whisper function, they can give in some string. If they give us a string that is pretty long, like excellent, maybe with some messed up capitalization, right? So this is some string. And so what I want this function to do is return the uppercase version of a string if it has a length longer than 4 characters. And if it has a length shorter than 4 characters, I want it to return the lowercase version of the string, right? So excellent definitely is longer than 4 characters. So here it should return all capital excellent. If I gave it a shorter word, let's say something like dog, that is less than 4 characters long. So that should just return a lowercase dog. And let's say I also messed up the capitalization over here, right? Just to show you that whenever you have a small word, you should lowercase it, right? And so let's work on this one. And so what I should do here is decide if my function takes in any data. And so I can just get that information from the example calls that we have over here. And so I just need to take in some string. So I'll just call it str. Remember that this behaves just like a variable. And when I call, let's say line 8, str becomes this string excellent. And what I want to do is check if the string has a long length, then uppercase it. If the string has a short length, then lowercase it. And so I could use a conditional right here. I can say, hey, if the length of that string, and what I said was if it's like greater than 4, then what I should do is return the uppercase version of that string. So that'll just be string dot to uppercase, right? Otherwise, I know it's shorter than 4 characters, so it's like 3 or less characters. And what I'll do is return the lowercase version of the string, right? So inside of my function, I'm using conditionals, and that's totally fine. You'll notice that I have 2 return statements here, but it's always going to be the case that only one of them actually execute, right? Because if I have some conditionals, it goes if else, the string is either greater than 4 characters or it's not greater than 4 characters, right? It can't be both at the same time. So with that, let's test our code. If I want to actually visually see any results, right? If I run this right now, I'm not going to see anything. And that's because although my functions return some uppercase or lowercase strings, I need to console.log them if I want to see them. And so the classic pattern we'll be using is having the console.log around the function calls, right? I still want my function to return on the inside, so I'm not going to put the console.log here. Instead, I put it around the function call. So let me add that into the mix. Nice, and there we have capital excellent and lowercase dog. Now let's give it another example. Let's say we call this function, we gave it another short string like me with some messed up capitalization. That should return all lowercase me because me is less than 4 characters, right? Or really less than or equal to 4 characters long. So it's really up to us to design what code we write inside of our functions. Any code that we wrote previously in the course, you can totally write inside of a function, but in particular, usually a function accomplishes a certain goal. One last thing I want to mention is just some terminology over here. So previously, you've heard me refer to this thing, like this variable-like thing, as a parameter. Again, it's just like the placeholder that represents like the input into this function. And so when we refer to this thing, we call it a parameter. When we refer to this thing, we refer to that as an argument. In other words, the parameter is like the abstract, like vague placeholder, whereas the argument is the actual data that replaces that placeholder, right? So if you hear a programmer talk about parameters or arguments, they usually refer to the same thing, but if you want to be super picky, again, the placeholder is the parameter, the actual concrete value is the argument. So that's all I got for this function lecture. In the next video, we're going to have some exercises to actually work on so we can practice reading and writing functions, right? Like I always say, if you want to improve as programmers, you definitely need to write code, right? So just watching these video lectures of me typing isn't going to do any justice. What you also want to do is work on those exercises. So stay tuned for the next one.